The first sound was a sickening metallic clang, an unnatural punctuation against the rhythmic hum of traffic far below and the gentle sigh of the wind across the wide expanse of the Henderson Bay Bridge. For Mark Harrison, it was the sound of his world tilting on its axis. It was followed by a sharp, indrawn gasp from his mother Eleanor, her small gloved hand flying to her chest, her eyes wide with a sudden, stark terror that mirrored the ice forming in Mark's own veins. He instinctively tightened his grip on her arm, a primal urge to shield her screaming through him, his head snapping towards the source of the commotion. And then he saw her, Karen Miller, president of their homeowners association. Her face a mask of pinched fury was wresting the spare oxygen tank, Eleanor's lifeline, from its small trolley. Before Mark could form a syllable, before his brain could fully process the outrageousness of the act, a cold dread sluicing through him. Karen, with a grunt of exertion, swung the green cylinder towards the bridge railing. "These things are an eyesore." Karen spat, her voice surprisingly level, yet edged with a chilling disdain that cut through the open air. "And frankly, some people just consume resources that could be better allocated. Progress requires difficult choices." But Cho, the tank arced over the railing, a silent, horrifying projectile against the pale blue of the late morning sky. Eleanor let out a thin, despairing cry, a sound that tore through Mark like shrapnel. The world seemed to slow. The green cylinder hung there for an eternal second before plummeting, disappearing from view, destined for the choppy gray waters hundreds of feet below. Eleanor swayed, a choked sob escaping her lips. My air." The words were a whisper, lost to the wind, but Mark felt them like a blow. A cold rage so pure and immediate it almost stole his own breath, surged through Mark. His mind, usually a calm inventory of procedures and protocols, became a chaotic whirlwind of anger and disbelief. One part of him, the son, wanted to scream, to shake Karen until her teeth rattled, but another older, more ingrained part was already clicking into place. The part that wore a badge, that knew the law, that was responsible for this very bridge. He gently steadied his mother, his eyes never leaving Karen, who now stood with her hands on her hips, a smirk of profound self-satisfaction twisting her lips. She looked as though she'd just tidied up a particularly offensive piece of litter, perhaps one that marred her grand vision for the community. Her gaze flickered towards him, a hint of challenge in it. "Karen." Mark began, his voice dangerously quiet, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with the bridge itself. He could feel the tremor in his mother's arm, hear the wheezing start in her breaths, as the remaining oxygen in her primary smaller tank, the one connected to her nasal cannula, began to deplete faster with her agitation and the sudden loss of her reserve. "Mark, good," Karen said, nodding sharply, utterly oblivious, or perhaps indifferent to the storm gathering in his gaze. "You can explain to your mother that HOA bylaws are quite clear about personal effects on public thoroughfares, especially items that could be considered hazardous or unsightly. We're trying to maintain a certain standard in this community, a premier image. Some find these displays detract from the property values we're all working so hard to elevate." She gestured vaguely, as if encompassing more than just the tank, perhaps towards the very concept of an elderly woman needing assistance. "As you know, I've been very clear about the need for Oakhaven to present a polished upscale image, especially with the new Gateway initiative pending. Every detail counts." He took a slow, deliberate breath, the salt-laced air feeling like grit in his lungs. "Karen Miller." He stated, his voice now devoid of any neighborly familiarity, replaced by a chilling formality. "You are under arrest." Karen blinked, her smirk, faltering, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Under arrest." "Don't be ridiculous, Mark. For what? Enforcing community standards? You of all people should appreciate that. I even had a chat with Councilman Davies last week about the importance of aesthetic cohesion in neighborhoods like ours. He was very supportive of my initiatives for Oakhaven." She gave a small, patronizing laugh. "Perhaps a warning this time, though I don't believe I've done anything wrong. My lawyer would certainly agree." "For attempted murder," Mark said, each word precise, cold, and heavy. "And felony elder abuse." He reached inside his jacket, his fingers closing around the cool metal of his badge. He pulled it out, letting it catch the sunlight, the gold eagle seeming to glare. I am Chief Harrison Bridge Patrol, Henderson Bay Authority. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Karen's jaw dropped. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin pasty and mottled. Her eyes, wide with dawning horror, flicked from the badge to Mark's unyielding expression, then to Eleanor, who was leaning heavily against him, her breathing becoming alarmingly shallow. The arrogance, the self-righteous fury, all of it, vanished, replaced by a raw animal fear. No, she whispered, shaking her head, her voice a mere thread. No, this is a misunderstanding. Mark, it was just an emphatic gesture, a point about regulations. I didn't mean, she has more oxygen, doesn't she? Her voice rose, cracking with panic. It's not like she was going to die. It was symbolic. Mark ignored her babbling, his focus shifting entirely to his mother. Mom, look at me. Deep breaths. We're going to get you more oxygen. Just hold on. He was already keying his radio, his voice calm and authoritative, despite the tremor of adrenaline coursing through him. Dispatch, this is Chief Harrison Henderson Bay Bridge, mid-span eastbound walkway. I have a medical emergency, elderly female respiratory distress, suspected hypoxia due to malicious removal of supplemental oxygen. Also require immediate police backup for a suspect in custody code 3. The squawk of the radio acknowledging his call seemed to echo the finality of Karen Miller's sudden, catastrophic miscalculation. The wind whipped around them, carrying the distant scream of sirens, growing steadily closer, a sound that for Karen Miller was no longer a backdrop to her ordinary power-obsessed life, but the overture to its complete unraveling. This horrifying incident on the bridge was not Karen Miller's first assault on Eleanor Harrison's peace, nor on the general well-being of the Oak Haven Estates community. It was merely the most brazen, the most visibly criminal. For months, Karen, armed with her HOA presidency and an unshakable belief in her own inherent superiority, had been waging a campaign of escalating harassment. Eleanor, with her quiet routines, her small patio garden, and her ever-present oxygen tank, had become a prime target. Mark lived a few blocks from his mother in Oak Haven, a place of manicured lawns that often hid petty tyrannies, mostly orchestrated by Karen. His role as Bridge Patrol Chief was demanding the bridge, a complex ecosystem consuming his hours. Yet, he always made time for Eleanor. 78, her lungs scarred from pneumonia. Decades ago, she relied on supplemental oxygen. Her mind, however, was sharp, her spirit gentle. Their walks were sacred. The trouble with Karen had begun subtly, a note about Eleanor's recycling bin, a comment about her walker. She just likes the sound of her own rules, Mom, Mark had said, but he'd also noticed Karen's increasing talk at HOA meetings about significant upcoming investments and the need to clear out unsightly elements to attract the right kind of new buyers. Once, at a sparsely attended finance committee update he'd sat in on, Karen had become visibly flustered and defensive when old Mr. Peterson, an accountant before he retired, had innocently asked for a more detailed breakdown of projected costs for a new community enhancement fund. Karen had quickly shut him down, citing confidential vendor negotiations. Mark had filed that away. The first direct shocking incident occurred 3 months before the bridge disaster. Eleanor tending her container garden, Karen appeared. Eleanor, this is simply unacceptable. Eleanor looked up. Oh, good morning, Karen. Is something wrong? Wrong, Karen scoffed. This mess is wrong. Bylaw 7, subsection C, patio areas must maintain a neat and orderly appearance. Marigolds are not on the approved list. It detracts from the uniform aesthetic we're trying to achieve, especially with the new gateway project under consideration. We need every property looking its best. We're trying to elevate the entire neighborhood, and these little inconsistencies, they matter. Eleanor's face fell. Oh, I didn't realize. They bring me such comfort. Comfort isn't the HOA's primary concern, Eleanor, Karen retorted. Aesthetic uniformity and property values are, and that, pointing at the oxygen tank, is another issue. Unsightly, potentially hazardous. No children play on my patio, Karen, Eleanor said softly. The tank is always safe. Your opinion. I'm issuing a formal warning. Dismantle this garden in 48 hours and find a less conspicuous place for your medical apparatus. Indoors entirely would be preferable. Mark found his mother in tears. He confronted Karen. My mother's garden isn't a hazard, and her oxygen is a medical necessity. Your demands are cruel. Karen was unmoved. Mark, rules are rules. Non-compliance means fines. We have standards. Perhaps if she spent less time on frivolous hobbies and more time indoors, it would be better. Some long-term residents don't appreciate the necessary upgrades we're planning or the associated costs. Those who can't keep up with the vision might find Oak Haven less suitable for them in the future. The implication was vile. Mark negotiated a compromise a few pots, but the incident festered. He documented Karen's interactions, noting her increasing push for expensive, opaque beautification projects and her dismissiveness towards anyone questioning the expenditures. The second incident happened at the spring potluck. Eleanor feeling well attended with Mark. Karen stopped at their table eyes on the oxygen tank. Eleanor, she said loudly, I must insist you find a more appropriate place for that device. It's making others uncomfortable. A tripping hazard. Mrs. Henderson, a neighbor with a tongue like a whip and a heart of gold, interjected, Nonsense, Karen, you old windbag. It's perfectly out of the way. If anyone's uncomfortable, it's likely due to your constant hectoring, not Eleanor's lifeline. Karen's face tightened. This is an official HOA matter, Mildred. And frankly, Eleanor parading your infirmities is unseemly. It casts a pall. We're projecting vitality here. The cruelty was stunning. Eleanor flushed. Mark stood. That's enough, Karen. Apologize. Apologize. Karen laughed a harsh bark. For truth, for upholding the community's desire for a pleasant atmosphere, hardly. If you can't manage her accessories, she should stay home. Murmurs rippled. Mr. Abernathy, a retired lawyer, known for his precise speech and quiet integrity, rose. Karen, your interpretation of pleasant atmosphere appears to involve the systematic bullying of vulnerable residents. That is not, nor has it ever been representative of this community's values. Furthermore, some of us have significant questions about these increasingly expensive atmosphere enhancements you advocate for with such singular focus, often without transparent accounting. Karen, realizing she'd overplayed her hand, waved dismissively. I'm merely ensuring comfort and safety. Some are so sensitive. She swept off. Eleanor was shaken. Maybe she's right, Mark, she whispered later. Don't you dare say that Mom, Mark had said, heart aching. She's a bully, and we're not letting her win. He considered formal action, but Eleanor, fearing retribution, begged him off. The consuming resources comment on the bridge, Mark now realized, was the poisonous fruit of a long-nurtured disdain, deeply entwined with Karen's grand and likely self-serving ambitions for Oak Haven. The sirens grew louder. Mark kept his mother secure. The first patrol car arrived. 2 officers, young alert, visibly startled to see their chief in this state, quickly took control of a now sobbing, incoherent Karen Miller. Mark provided a concise, clipped summary of the event. Paramedics were next, their calm efficiency a balm. She's stabilizing, Chief. 1 paramedic. Sarah, a familiar face from previous bridge incidents, reported her expression serious. Her sats were dropping, but they're coming back up with our O2. We need to get her to the hospital immediately. The shock alone is a serious concern, let alone the oxygen deprivation. Of course, Mark said, his hand gently stroking his mother's forehead. Whatever she needs. He looked at Eleanor. Her eyes fluttered open, finding his. A weak smile touched her lips. My brave boy. She whispered, her voice raspy but audible over the rising wind. Always, Mom. He replied, his throat tight. As Eleanor was carefully loaded onto the gurney, Mark turned his attention back to the scene. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Davies, a stolid, reliable man, was already conferring with the police. Lieutenant, Mark instructed, full sweep of the underside of this section by the Marine unit. We need to recover that oxygen tank. It's critical evidence. And he paused, the full weight of Karen's words hitting him again. A thorough search of the waters below. Standard procedure, but be meticulous. Understood, Chief, Davies replied, his gaze compassionate. Are you heading to the hospital? Yes, I need to be with my mother. He looked over at Karen Miller, now handcuffed and being placed into the back of a police cruiser. Her face was pressed against the window, an expression of utter desolation and disbelief. The arrogant HOA president was gone, replaced by a terrified woman. "But I'll be at the precinct later to give my full statement. Make sure she's processed properly. Attempted murder, felony, elder abuse." And note her exact words. "Some people just consume resources that could be better allocated. Progress requires difficult choices." And her comment about elevating property values. Every syllable. "Will do, Chief. We'll get the harbor master on the tank recovery right away." Mark took one last look at the vast expanse of the bridge, the wind still howling a mournful song. Then he turned and walked towards the ambulance, his duty as a son momentarily and necessarily eclipsing his duty as an officer, though the two had become inextricably, terribly intertwined on this windswept stretch of concrete and steel. At the hospital, the ER team moved with practiced urgency. Mark paced the sterile waiting room, the adrenaline slowly ebbing, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a simmering, controlled anger. He replayed the scene on the bridge, Karen's sneering face, the horrifying arc of the tank, his mother's gasp of pure fear, the way her breath had started to catch. Each replay solidified his resolve. Karen Miller would not get away with this. Hours later, a doctor, a calm woman with tired eyes, finally emerged. "Mr. Harrison, your mother is stable. Her oxygen levels are good, heart rate is steady. No immediate signs of cardiac distress beyond what we'd expect from such a profound shock. We'd like to keep her overnight for observation, run a few more tests in the morning just to be safe." Relief so potent it almost buckled his knees washed over Mark. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much. Can I see her?" "Of course. She's been asking for you." Eleanor was propped up in bed, looking pale, but remarkably composed. A new oxygen cannula was in place, and the steady hiss of the flow meter was the most comforting sound Mark had ever heard. "Oh, Mark," she said, her voice stronger now, though still bearing a trace of the ordeal. "That awful woman." "She's in police custody, Mom," Mark said, taking her hand, its familiar frailness a stark contrast to the iron strength of her spirit. "She won't be bothering you or anyone else for a very long time." What she said about resources and progress. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, not of fear this time, but of a deep, wounded hurt. It was so unthinkably cruel. It was monstrous, Mom, and it's not true. You are precious. Your life is precious. He squeezed her hand, and she will answer for what she did. Every single word, every single action. He stayed with her until she drifted off to sleep, the lines of fear on her face finally softening. Only then did he leave for the police precinct, his mind now shifting fully into professional mode. He spent the next 3 hours giving a meticulous, detailed statement to Detective Ramirez, a seasoned officer whose expression grew grimmer with each revelation. Mark detailed not only the events on the bridge, but also the history of Karen Miller's harassment, the specific incidents, her comments about property values, community upgrades, and her defensiveness about financial questions. He provided the notes he had kept. "This isn't just a random act of violence," Chief Harrison, Ramirez said, when Mark had finished leaning back in his chair. "This is a clear pattern of targeted abuse, culminating in a life-threatening assault. Her comments about resources and progress, that's motive clear as day. And your position as Bridge Patrol Chief, witnessing it directly, arresting her yourself, that's ironclad for the assault. The background you've provided, her focus on finances and property values, her irritation with those questioning costs, that paints an interesting, broader picture. We'll be looking into all of it." "I want the book thrown at her, Detective," Mark said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion but heavy with intent. "Attempted murder, elder abuse, hate crime, if applicable, based on her targeting of the elderly. I want to ensure she never has the power to harm anyone again." "We'll do our best, Chief. Your testimony, your mother's, and this background, it's strong. Given her position in the HOA, this will make waves. We'll certainly look into the HOA's governance and any other complaints that might have been filed against her. Sometimes, where there's this much smoke, there's a bigger fire." As Mark left the precinct, the city lights seemed harsh, unforgiving. He thought about Oak Haven. For years, Karen Miller had operated with impunity, her petty cruelties tolerated. Now her reign was definitively over, but the damage, the fear would linger. The next morning, after a restless night, Mark returned to the hospital. Eleanor was sitting up, eating a light breakfast, and even managed a small, genuine smile when he entered. "The nurses here are angels," she said, her voice almost back to normal. "They are," Mark agreed. "How are you feeling? Really better. A bit shaky, but better. I think what I need most is to go home, to my own things, my garden." The doctors agreed she could be discharged with instructions for rest and follow-up appointments. As Mark helped her gather her few things, his phone buzzed. It was Lieutenant Davies. "Chief, we recovered the oxygen tank. It was lodged in some maintenance netting under the bridge about 50 feet down from the walkway. Damaged, dented pretty badly on one side, but intact. We're processing it now. Marine unit also did a full sweep of the water below. Nothing else found, thankfully." "Good work, Davies. Excellent. Thank you." Another piece of the puzzle, another nail in Karen Miller's coffin. Driving Eleanor home, Mark felt a strange sense of unreality. The streets of Oak Haven looked the same, the lawns were still manicured, the houses uniformly painted. Yet everything had changed. A dark undercurrent had been brutally exposed. When they pulled up to Eleanor's small house, they were greeted by an unexpected sight. Mrs. Henderson was on Eleanor's porch, along with Mr. Abernathy and several other residents Mark recognized. There were flowers, a casserole dish, and expressions of genuine concern and outrage. "Eleanor, dear," Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, bustling forward, her usual sharp tone softened with genuine affection. "Saints preserve us, what that witch put you through. We heard what happened. It's just dreadful. Are you all right, love?" That Karen Miller. Mr. Abernathy huffed, his face flushed with indignation, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I always maintained she was a menace to the foundational principles of this community. Attempted murder. It is beyond the pale. And her constant, almost fanatical obsession with those gold-plated projects, deflecting any sensible fiscal inquiry." Eleanor, overwhelmed but clearly touched, allowed herself to be fussed over. Mark watched a small sense of warmth spreading through him. Perhaps this terrible event could in some way bring the community closer. Later that day, after settling his mother, the news of Karen's arrest was spreading like wildfire. HOA president arrested for attempted murder of elderly resident on Henderson Bay Bridge. Arresting officer is victim's son, bridge patrol chief. The media lapped it up. A few days later, an emergency HOA meeting was called, not by Karen, who was out on a hefty bail, but facing a mountain of charges and public disgrace, but by a group of concerned residents led by a determined Mr. Abernathy and a fiery Mrs. Henderson. The clubhouse, the scene of one of Karen's earlier humiliations of Eleanor, was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with a mixture of anger, betrayal, fear, and a dawning sense of violated trust. Mark attended with Eleanor, who, despite her ordeal, insisted on being there. "I need to see this, Mark," she'd said, her voice quiet but firm. "I won't be hidden away." She sat quietly, her composure a stark contrast to the simmering outrage around her. Mark was asked to speak not as bridge patrol chief, but as a resident, a son. He stood before his neighbors, his voice clear and steady. He recounted the incident on the bridge, the history of harassment his mother had endured. He spoke of Karen's hateful words, her justification of cruelty in the name of progress and property values. "She spoke of my mother, and by extension others like her, as mere consumers of resources, as unsightly elements, detrimental to an image she was desperate to cultivate, an image seemingly tied to ever-increasing, vaguely explained expenditures." A wave of murmurs and exclamations swept the room. Mr. Abernathy then took the floor, his bearing dignified. "Friends, neighbors, we all know Karen's ambition, her persistent narrative regarding necessary upgrades, the new security gates for which she presented wildly inflated quotations, the landscaping contracts awarded to obscure entities with no track record. For years, many of us have harbored quiet and sometimes not so quiet concerns about the escalating fees and the distinct lack of transparency concerning where precisely our money was being directed." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Following Karen's arrest for the appalling, reprehensible attack on Eleanor Harrison, Detective Ramirez, at my urging, and with Chief Harrison's input, began to examine more than just that singular incident. He initiated inquiries into the fiscal management of our homeowners association inquiries that some of us have been suggesting were long overdue. Before Mr. Abernathy could continue, a tremor of movement rippled through a small, usually unnoticed utility closet door near the side of the clubhouse. Mark, hyper-aware, caught the slight shift. He'd half expected Karen might try something, her arrogance perhaps blinding her to the new reality. Had she been listening? Just as Mr. Abernathy was about to elaborate on the police's preliminary interest, the main doors of the clubhouse burst open. A man Mark didn't recognize stood there looking pale, nervous, but resolute. He clutched a battered leather briefcase to his chest as if it were a shield. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice shaking slightly, but carrying in the suddenly silent room. "Is this the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association meeting? I need to speak. About Karen Miller, and about where a lot of your money has been going." A collective gasp went through the room. All eyes turned to the newcomer. "My name is Arthur Jenkins," he said, stepping forward into the aisle, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces. I own a small landscaping company, or I should say I used to before Karen Miller effectively ruined it. She approached me 2 years ago. She had grandiose plans for beautifying Oak Haven Estates. She made it very clear if I wanted the lucrative contracts, I would have to inflate my invoices by a non-negotiable 30%. That extra 30%, it wasn't for better materials or more labor. It went directly every cent to a holding company she personally controlled. A shell corporation, essentially. He fumbled with the latches of his briefcase and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. "I have copies of the original bids, the grossly inflated invoices she forced me to submit, and the wire transfer records from my business account to Oak Haven Premier Enhancements LLC, her company. I did it because I was desperate for the work my business was struggling. But I couldn't live with the guilt, the constant fear. When she threatened to blacklist me entirely, to spread rumors that would destroy my reputation if I ever breathed a word of it, I kept quiet. But when I heard what she did to Mrs. Harrison, an elderly woman, over an oxygen tank, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. The evil of it just broke something in me." The room erupted. Shouts of "thief," "fraud," "boob," "monster" echoed off the walls. People were on their feet, yelling, pointing their faces masks of fury and betrayal. The revelation was a bombshell far more visceral and damning than vague suspicions. And then, the side utility door, the one Mark had noticed, flew open with a crash. Karen Miller stood there, no longer the composed HOA president, but a creature of pure, unadulterated rage and panic. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She must have been hiding, listening to her empire crumble. Her lawyer was conspicuously absent. "Lies, all venomous, contemptible lies," she shrieked, her voice raw, cracking with hysteria. She lunged not towards Jenkins initially, but towards the podium where Mr. Abernathy stood, as if to silence the voice of authority. "He's a disgruntled contractor, a failure. You can't believe him. I built this community. I made it desirable, valuable. I did what had to be done." Mark reacted instantly, moving to intercept her, shouting, "Karen, stop." But 2 burly residents, a retired firefighter and a construction foreman who lived down the street, were closer. They grabbed Karen's arms before she could reach Mr. Abernathy, who recoiled startled, but holding his ground. Jenkins, seeing her deranged state, backed away, dropping some of his crucial papers, which scattered across the floor. Karen thrashed wildly in the resident's grip, a desperate cornered animal. "He's lying. They're all in on it. Abernathy, he's just jealous of my success. He wanted this position." She then rounded on Jenkins. "And you pathetic little man, you'll pay for this. I'll sue you into oblivion." Her eyes then found Eleanor, a look of pure venom passing over her face. "And she started all of this. Eleanor Harrison was an obstacle, always questioning, always complaining, a drain on resources. All of you who resist progress, who cling to the past, you are obstacles to what Oak Haven could be." Her screaming confession, her admission of Eleanor as an obstacle, directly linked to her resistance, hung in the air more damning than anything Jenkins could have presented. The raw, unfiltered malice was terrifying to behold. Detective Ramirez, who had at Mark's discreet prior request been situated with a plainclothes officer near that very side entrance precisely for such a contingency, Mark's instincts about Karen's volatile nature proving tragically accurate, stepped forward calmly with his colleague. "Karen Miller, Ramirez announced, his voice cutting through the pandemonium like a razor. "You are under arrest, again. This time for multiple counts of grand larceny, embezzlement, wire fraud, and witness intimidation in connection with your activities as president of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association." Karen went limp in the resident's grasp, the fight suddenly completely draining out of her. The furious energy vanished, leaving behind a hollow-eyed, slack-jawed despair. As the officers efficiently handcuffed her for the second time in less than a week, the only sound in the stunned clubhouse was her ragged, sobbing breaths and the rustle of Arthur Jenkins' papers being carefully gathered from the floor by a visibly shaken Mrs. Henderson. The community watched in a kind of horrified silence, the spectacle of her utter and public unraveling a shocking yet profoundly cathartic climax to her reign of terror. In the weeks and months that followed, the full sordid extent of Karen Miller's deceit unraveled in court filings and extensive news reports. The legal process was slow but relentless. Her assets were frozen. The shell companies were meticulously dissected. The kickback schemes were laid bare for all to see. The charge of attempted murder, supported by Mark's unwavering testimony, the recovered dented oxygen tank, and Karen's own damning words on the bridge, and her hysterical confession at the HOA meeting, stuck. The elder abuse charges, bolstered by the accounts of other residents who had suffered under her petty tyranny, added further weight. And the financial crimes, with Arthur Jenkins's brave testimony and meticulously kept records, as the cornerstone painted a devastating picture of a woman driven by insatiable greed and an astonishing, narcissistic sense of entitlement. Karen Miller was ultimately convicted on all major counts. The judge, a stern-faced woman renowned for her sharp intellect and intolerance for corruption, in her sentencing remarks, cited Karen's appalling lack of remorse, the calculated predatory cruelty of her actions, particularly the vicious attack on Eleanor Harrison, and the systematic plundering of community trust and finances. She was sentenced to a significant prison term, one that ensured she would not be troubling Oak Haven or any other community for many years to come. Her ill-gotten gains were ordered to be seized and, where possible, restituted to the Oak Haven HOA. The community, through a newly elected and scrupulously honest board, headed by a reluctant but determined Mr. Abernathy with Mrs. Henderson as his outspoken but effective treasurer, began the arduous process of rebuilding its finances and, more importantly, its trust. The focus shifted entirely from grandiose self-serving projects to sensible, transparent management and genuine community well-being. Transparency became the new watchword. Bylaws were reviewed and rewritten with multiple safeguards to prevent the kind of abuse of power Karen had reveled in. Regular open town hall meetings were instituted, fostering a genuine sense of collective ownership and responsibility that had been sorely lacking. For Eleanor, the journey to healing was both physical and emotional. The community, once a source of anxiety due to Karen's insidious presence, now rallied around her with a genuine warmth and protective support that was profoundly moving. People stopped by with home-cooked meals, offered to help with her garden, which was now flourishing marigolds, defiantly vibrant alongside rosemary and lavender, or simply sat and chatted on her small patio, now free of any HOA-mandated restrictions. The fear that Karen had so deliberately instilled slowly, painstakingly receded, replaced by a renewed sense of belonging and safety. Her breathing, Mark noted with quiet relief, even seemed to improve slightly with the significant reduction in stress, though the oxygen tank, a newer, more compact model, remained her constant, faithful companion. Mark watched his mother rediscover her small joys, her gentle spirit, so long suppressed, re-emerging like a flower after a harsh winter. He found his own deep, resonant peace in seeing justice done not just for Eleanor, but for the entire community that Karen had sought to dominate and defraud. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost exactly a year after Karen's dramatic arrest on the bridge, Mark and Eleanor found themselves once again on the Henderson Bay Bridge walkway. The air was cold, but the sun was a brilliant, benevolent gold, glinting off the deep blue water far below. Eleanor, bundled in a warm scarlet coat that brought a touch of color to her cheeks, walked with a steady, unhurried gait, her new securely fastened oxygen tank rolling quietly beside her. "It's still so beautiful, isn't it?" Eleanor said, her voice clear and strong, tinged with a quiet earned resilience. She looked out at the vast panorama of sea and sky, no longer with a shadow of fear in her eyes, but with a serene, almost defiant appreciation. She took a deep, deliberate breath, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw her shoulders relax in a way they hadn't for years. "It is Mom," Mark agreed, putting his arm around her shoulder, feeling the comforting familiar strength beneath the soft wool of her coat. The bridge, once the scene of such profound terror and violation, had been reclaimed. It was no longer just a structure of steel and concrete to him, nor solely a place of professional duty. It was a symbol of a terrible trial, overcome of justice, ultimately prevailing, and of the enduring, astonishing strength of the human spirit, particularly his mother's. He remembered the icy dread he'd felt watching that tank fall, the sheer panic for her life, a feeling so visceral it still sometimes caught him unawares in quiet moments. Now standing here, that memory felt distant, overlaid by the quiet triumph of this peaceful afternoon. They stood there for a long while, in comfortable, companionable silence, watching the gulls circle lazily overhead, and the distant ferries crisscross the bay, leaving white wakes on the blue. The air felt clean, fresh, and wonderfully, blessedly abundant. The shadow of Karen Miller, heavy and oppressive for so long, had finally lifted not just from their lives, but from the entire community of Oak Haven. The sounds of the bridge, the rhythmic hum of traffic, the metallic sigh of the wind through the girders, the distant, mournful clang of a buoy, were just sounds again, no longer imbued with menace or the echoes of cruelty, but part of the ongoing, resilient, beautiful rhythm of life. And for Eleanor Harrison and her son Mark, every breath was indeed precious, and now, finally, truly, deeply peaceful. Oak Haven, once a byword for HOA tyranny, slowly became known for its revitalized community spirit, its engaged citizenry, a quiet testament to what can happen when good people push too far, finally stand together against those who seek to divide, exploit, and diminish. The bridge in their shared memory was no longer a place of trauma, but a profound reminder that even from the most terrifying, dizzying heights of despair, one could always find a path back to solid ground, and that even the most determined, insidious darkness could eventually inevitably be overcome by the simple, unwavering light of decency, courage, and love.